I think everybody wants to lead a full and meaningful life. There are these special parts of life that seem to reflect a deeper significance, a deeper meaning. And these places and processes and times, well, we set them aside. And the human family has done that also. They call them holy or sacred. We do this. We do it all the time. And so today I want to talk about how can we practice holiness and what's the language we use to do that. Is it possible? Now, when it comes to the holy, all religions, with or without a deity, have some sense of understanding of the holy. In the West, our understanding is basically based in the Hebrew, which is kadosh, which means to set apart from ordinary things. Land, the ark, tablets of the law, the food of the priests. By the way, nowhere in the Bible does it say human beings are holy, but we'll get to that. In the East, it's kind of a different thing. There's this whole concept of, they don't use the word holy, like holy man in the way that we do, but they do use the word Brahman. The word, some of us have heard it as Brahman, but Brahman. I know it as Brahman because I took a lot of world religion classes, and the professors had lived in India, and that's how they pronounced it. The word Brahman means to make or render great. And if you pull the word apart, it means to grow, to increase, to roar like a lion. It's this place in us where the quality and of our own being can be, if you will, recognized and shown. Now, as different as the word holy is in different religions, in the West there's degrees of holiness. There's all kinds of, all things in the world are a little bit holy. Animals are a little bit more holy than inanimate things. And people, although more holy than animals, it really doesn't say in Scripture that that's the case. As a matter of fact, it's impossible within most theological things for people to be holy within Western thinking because we're caught up in sin. As the Hebrews say, it's only when you're dead that you become holy because you can still choose evil when you're alive, which is interesting. Again, then God, of course, is the most holy. However, here's what I want us to get. In the East, we can define holy basically as purity or perfection. In the West, it's also about purity and perfection, but we can never attain it. And I'm not sure we want to. I think life's an algorithm, and we've had podcasts on that. It's a infinitely variable, omnidirectional happening, and it's multidimensional. But I want to talk about something today because I think our understanding of the holy needs to find a new place in the lexicon. Just as anything can be set aside, and we do that. I mean, birth, coming of age ceremonies, marriage, death, we set these places aside very clearly. And if you look at up the word holy, if you look it up, you find that it's related to God in most cases. But when it comes down to is this moral and spiritual perfection, which I'm going to suggest is bogus. And I want to suggest that we need to recalibrate our sense of the holy. There's a great word called consecration. When we started a new church, we went and we consecrated it. We prayed. Every week I was part of a communion church. We would pray over the bread and the wine, and it would be consecrated, made holy. I am in my deepest heart am convinced that the human family needs to understand that the Holy Land is not in Israel, it's not in the Americas, it's not in Asia, it is the planet Earth herself. Our whole understanding of a Holy Land now, as we look into the vast spaces of the universe, that life found a place to set up camp, see, that's holy for me. I think if we start seeing holy as that place of our growing edge, where, as the Brahman says, we are becoming great. We are making and growing and increasing, and we are celebrating in that uncovering. I think of the word Israel, which means to wrestle with God. When we are sincerely wrestling with the truth, with what is real, with what is moral and ethical, we are ourselves made holy. And we are calling up whole new symbols that call us to this holiness. I'm saying the planet Earth is one of those. Just as we had the crucifixion for all these years, now we have these pictures of what our environmental consequences have been, which is, we've destroyed whole seas and lakes and oceans and rivers. It's amazing how we can begin to see the holy in new ways. Times, places, objects, people, and nature, all of us together in this holy happening, and yet still sorting it out between the sacred and the profane, between those processes that make things grow, that bring life and truth to light, versus those things that cover up and keep us from the next growing piece. Now, I've just laid out a whole lot about practicing holiness, but I'm convinced that each of us are holy and on a journey of deep meaning, of deep understandings and mysteries. And if we could share those, if we could begin to have a language that allows us to reconsecrate this moment, that we might live a little more clearly on the growing edge of our own life, a little more clearly on the breaking edge of time, that we might be here now and receive this moment in all its fullness and respond with all the fullness of our own being. See, practicing holiness, it's a time-consuming thing, but it really is just about what the Buddha was saying all along in his 3 great rules. Pay attention, pay attention, pay attention. So, practicing holiness, I just laid out a whole lot of stuff, my cohorts. Bob Hayes coming from Florida, Mary Ann coming from down in the valley of Spokane, Washington. I'll let you start us, Bob. What say you on this practicing holiness and everything I've just laid out?
Well, it's certainly a lot, and I'll add something to it. You spoke of the East, but you were pretty much focusing on Hinduism and the Indian subcontinent. But there's another piece to the East around us as a happening, as something that's moving constantly changing, and we're moving and changing with it.
And that was the Tao, you said?
Well, the Tao, yeah. Taoism primarily. But what they say is, they wouldn't use the term holy, but it kind of resonates in the same way, and that is being engaged with the movement that is all around us in the way that is intended to be. Now, I'm anthropomorphizing by just using the word intended, but if there's this movement, there is a most efficient way to be with that movement. And that is one way to look at holiness. And if we want to define it, we can go back to all of these signposts that we've talked about over the months of different shows, things like the Golden Rule and things that help us guide us through this movement. And you combine that with the idea of as you were saying, of building something greater, then I think that we can strive to be in that movement that is not just dragging us along, but we can actually direct it and be part of it.
Amen. How about you, Mary Ann?
Yeah, I think sometimes when the word holy is used, we live in a world of opposites. So you think of holy, I think of unholy. You think of sacred, you think of profane. It's a different way of looking at it, and and I could be wrong, but it almost sounds like being in that flow is where you're not having this dual thing. But for me, I think that, I was raised in the West. I was raised with all of these ideas of what is good and what isn't, what is holy and what is not. And the goal always was to be holy, to be a good person, to do good things in the world, to create things. And a side note, I saw a play this weekend, Wicked, and where they take the story of what it actually means to be wicked and what it actually means to be good, and flips it a little bit. And I think that's kind of what we need to do. We need to really examine what do those words mean and what weight do they carry. And so I remember I'm not a big person, but I remember that at one point Jesus said, "Don't call me holy. There's none holy but God." So even in that teaching, there's a recognition that holy is not something that we attain, but I think it is actions. I think we can have things that we behave, the growth that we go through can benefit others. And to me, that's trying to create a whole world. So not necessarily holy, but I go to WHOLE. And so is holy really becoming whole? And is that what our goal can be? So that's where my thoughts meander around.
and I have to say, I think that you're right, that wholeness is it. The problem or the mystery of it is there's no final resolution. So we can't get there and have it. It's something that we are always, that's what process theology is about, that you are the process itself. That's what Buddha is about when he says there's no I. It's a process happening there's a continuity that's created by the process, and you identify it as I, but that's a delusion, and don't get so attached to it. And a couple things you all have said about this. One is, Bob, as you were speaking, the word accord came in over and over, moving with it. We're still trying to understand what the movement is that is life and wholeness and most reflects what is most healthy for us. As well, you talked a little bit about growing edge. I think our growing edge is where the true play of life and consciousness and being is dancing, and where we can participate in it. And that's why I over and over ask our podcast listeners, find your growing edge. Talk about it with others. Find a language. If you think your growing edge is the same now as it was 20 years ago, I think you need some review and recalibration, just like I'm talking about recalibrating the understanding of the word holy. And Marianne, you brought up the whole concept of sorting out. How do we sort out those things which, once you think of holy, you think of the sacred and the profane. For me, is the language I use. But you think of unholy. How do you sort out? What is the grid that sorts out what constitutes true goodness and health and wholeness? And what's best for everybody. And I think the human family is working on that a little bit. Go ahead, Bob.
Well, that's where those signposts come in. And Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit paleontologist, was a very process-oriented thinker. And what he said this movement was going toward was what he called the omega point. And he viewed Jesus Christ as the prototype that humanity was moving towards. And that might be one way to define holy, is that are you in accord with the movement towards the prototype that we're intended to be?
No, I hear you. And I think you bring into, we're getting back to, the word wholeness and health come into this so radically in my mind. Marianne, the word that kept coming to my mind as you were speaking is fullness, that there are always higher orders of understanding that we have to put things, context. Mental illness, we used to mistake a whole lot of stuff that we now say is is due to mental illness. We used to lock those people up because we couldn't understand them. We couldn't figure it out. And so, measures are inherent in this. And I think what Bob brought up is this call to a new measure of Jesus as an omega point. And I think that's when I talked about in my opening about creating symbols that call us to holiness. I think that we're really trying to do that. I don't know if y'all are following Brene Brown all. I do a little bit, but I think she's on the leading edge of a lot of this, of just talking about it, getting over our understanding of dogmatic perfection. When we say God is perfect, we pull something into our mind and then we try to meet it when that's what screws us up. Holiness is seeing the imperfection, the asymmetry, and then approaching it in a feedback place where we can see and feel that ain't going to work. That's just going to cause more suffering. I refer back to our previous podcast.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and we need a language to talk about it. And I think that's something that you mentioned Brene Brown, and I think that's what she's trying to lay out in her new book. But it's how do we talk about that and what does it mean? And so then how do we get there?
And I think that, that's what Freud and Jung and all the psychologists were doing. They're seeing all these human pieces and we're trying to understand how they fit. And it's really kind of an amazing trip, man. Go ahead, Bob. Oh, no, we seem to have locked up. Maybe I should just talk until we unlock. I'm not sure.
Well, I'm just going to say that.
Go ahead, Bob.
Go ahead. I was going to say that we get derailed by the way that humans tend to take what is the symbol of movement toward the holiness and put it into an institution, put it into an object, put it into a piece of dogma. And suddenly that becomes the end product instead of this omega point or the freedom from the wheel of life or whatever we're moving toward. We stop that process by locking into a static, we could call it an idol, if you will.
Yeah.
And that I was going to say, and that's because then we can wrap our brain around that, and we don't have to live in the uncertainty of where that's going. We can be certain of that. We can name it, we can define it, we can be certain. And that's where we get stuck.
More comfortable. Yeah.
And we can put it in our pocket, carry it around with us, and call on it. But it becomes a straw man. It becomes something that is less real and does have a point of diminishing returns. And I think that's what we see through history over and over as the human beings hold on to something that's true and revealing and turn it into a dogma. And then that dogma ends up limiting the very vision that gave rise to it in the first place. And over the human family has repeated this, and I dare say we're repeating it now as a global family because we can't come together as a global family. We lack the language of global familiality, whatever the hell that word is, that shows us that we're all at the very, very farthest differences, 17th cousins. And we're all related. And if we can't somehow find a way to bring our understandings to the table, because then we will not stay alive, I don't believe. I think our civilization will go. So I am really suggesting a recalibration of how we define holiness, that it's not just those things we set aside, but those things we set inside. And that is, each of us are doing that anyway. And Marianne, when you talk about, I don't know, can't remember exactly how you said it, but sorting out what makes us grow versus what keeps us impedes our growth, that's it. I think that is the journey right there. And It doesn't make the mystery go away. It doesn't give us something we can hold on to and make a carving of and stick it in our pocket and hold on to. It basically says everything's made of ice. Anything image you carve, any dogma you make, when you put it in your pocket, it still turns to the living water. It becomes this thing. So I'm suggesting a new language of consecration. My friends, your life is holy. And I would like to see you intentionally be involved in making it holy every day. And I don't know if you pray, if you got to set aside time. I find as I get older, I set aside less time and praying just happens. You know, when I'm chopping wood, I find my mind going to people who are Republicans, who are good people, to people who are dying of cancer. These are friends of mine. I find my mind going to those places, and it's interesting how what I call prayer happens, and what prayer is even changing in my mind. So, making holy, Bob, Marianne, how can you see us reconsecrating each of our individual lives and all the nooks and crannies? And, you know, they say that when you consecrate something, it separates it from the ordinary, but I want the ordinary to be consecrated, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
Again, I'm going to get back to the movement that we're a part of. And I think that word accord that you used, Redhawk, is so powerful. If we can be in accord with that movement and use those signposts, use those exemplars, use the best among us to guide us through the movement, then that is how we can discern what is the holy way from what is the profane way.
Yeah, you know, and I think I kind of, my mind goes back to the definition of holy and the idea of being dedicated to God. Well, if your idea of God is a static thing versus what you're talking about, a movement, if God is love, and then you are dedicated to love, it is a moving process. It's an action. It's not a thing. And so I think that for us to, you know, I often go back to the idea of Spirit in the Street. And one day I am going to get my blog up that's called Spirit in the Street. But it addresses this exact idea that every single encounter is sacred. Every single thing that happens affects things that we have no idea what that effect is. And it's that movement, it's that idea that that nothing is inconsequential. Everything has a consequence, even the smallest act. So I think that's taking that idea of, and Hindus, I mean, they talk about this in their religion, the whole idea of everything being sacred, even, you know, the muck of life is sacred, right? But anyway, that's where I go.
All right. And here's the piece I want us to get. And Marianne, you brought this out beautifully. It's interesting that the word Holocaust literally means burnt offering. It got that name because all that suffering had to be for something. It was offered up as a burnt offering that it might never happen again. And that's part of this holiness. Even that which is most profane can be consecrated and made holy. And my understanding, if you go, because these camps were kept as museums, that it's very quiet there. When I went to the Holocaust Museum, it was very quiet. People didn't speak real loud. They spoke in whispers. It was an amazing thing in my mind of how that works. And also that that the holy is a verb. It's a movement. It's an action. It is closer to our understanding of the Tao than it is to anything you can put in your pocket. It's this movement that we're a part of. That's why I say your growing edge. Your growing edge is growing, man. It's moving, okay? And the Brahman in you, when it finally comes out, it makes touch with what's called the Atman, which is the same presence of the whole universe. You connect with the universal oneness of being, and you roar. Your voice begins to speak with an authority. So I want us to see that it's this process that we're a part of. It is a sacred process. There are profane aspects, but the profane can be consecrated and made sacred when we put it into a proper context. And that this love, this life, this consciousness, this whole mystery of being is really about the consecration itself of the mystery. This podcast, I could say this podcast is dedicated to the consecration of the mystery of it all. So on that note, Marianne, final comment?
I think you just touched on something that we talked about, I don't know if it was last week or the week before, about suffering and the meaning of suffering. And is that what the holiness can rise out of, from finding meaning? And again, I still think that it is a mystery. We don't know. We don't know the answers, and all we can do is the best that we can. And I always go back to, we need to work on ourselves, our awareness, the way we interact in the world, and understand that there is no definitive answer for the way we should be or the way we shouldn't be. We just have to muddle our way through it. And that's all I do, is I just muddle my way through all this.
Oh boy, I'll tell you what, a theology of muddling. I like that very much, because it's so messy and everybody tries to make it neat. Bob, final comments?
Well, this doesn't happen often, but I'm going to slightly disagree with Marianne here. I think there are ways to tell the difference between the holiness and the profane. And those are those signposts again that we keep talking about. And one of those signposts says that we should be moving toward the truth. So when we hear Vladimir Putin say he's invading Ukraine to fight against the Nazis, that is such a horrendous lie that goes in the face of the Holocaust, as you were talking about it, and the fact that the president, we have to be able to distinguish the truth from the lies.
Yes, and I think that's part of what's going on with the human family right now. And I know right now, a lot of people, we're praying. We're praying hard and heavy. I pray for more holiness, for a greater understanding of it. I pray because I feel like I'm always falling short, and then I pray for the laughter, because the whole concept of falling short is delusion, and I'm just reaching for the next thing and losing my grip on one thing and finding my grip on another. But prayer is an interesting thing. I wonder, some people who, the dogmatic atheists, they totally poo-poo prayer. And a good question is, does prayer affect the world, or does prayer just affect the prayer? How do we look at what prayer really is? If consciousness isn't just what's in my head, but what dances between us, then prayer should have some utility. It should have some facility. What is this prayer? Now, I've often said that this every siren is a call to prayer. When I hear a siren, something in me just kicks in, and I just go, wow, hope everything's okay. Is it an ambulance? Is it somebody getting busted? What is it? What is this prayer thing? We're going to kind of explore it, because it's one more mystery. It's one more place where consciousness is reaching. It's one more place where we seek to touch each other and be touched. My friends, God's peace, and in all things, may you be the voice of the one.